Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the material you send us and, well, dive deep into it.
Yeah, unpack the key ideas.
And today, we've got some really interesting stuff, a report on recent archaeology. We're going to be looking at early North American history.
And specifically how our understanding is kind of being reshaped right now.
Exactly. If you want a quick way to get up to speed on some pretty big shifts in how we see the past, based on these new findings, this is for you.
Absolutely. The report zeroes in on how new dating techniques, really precise ones, are challenging these long-held ideas about indigenous societies.
Especially in Eastern North America, right, after Europeans first made contact.
Precisely. So our mission, really, is to figure out how these advancements are essentially rewriting that history.
Okay, let's jump in. The report starts with the basics, how archaeologists used to approach this period. What were those older methods?
Well, for a long time, the main approach was looking for European stuff.
Yeah,
Right.
tools or beads.
Exactly. Iron blades, glass beads, things that clearly came from Europe. And finding those was often the key indicator for dating a site.
So more European items meant a later date, maybe.
That was often the assumption, yeah. It helped define the quote-unquote historic period, separating it from the pre-contact era.
But the report mentions archaeologists like Michelle Piggott, finding this really frustrating. She calls it an arbitrary division of time. Why the frustration?
Well, think about it. You're defining a continent's history based on the arrival of one specific group. It kind of sidelines the indigenous history that came before, and, crucially, how it continued after contact.
Right. It puts all the focus on the European arrival.
And, as the report points out, just relying on finding those artifacts can be pretty misleading. Their presence or absence doesn't tell the whole story.
And besides the artifact issue, there were technical problems too, weren't there? With dating organic things from that specific window, the 1400s to the 1600s?
Oh, absolutely. Radiocarbon dating, measuring the decay of carbon-14, it hit a rough patch for those centuries.
Rough patch. How so?
The amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere wasn't stable back then. It fluctuated quite a bit.
Ah, so the baseline measurement was moving.
Exactly. Imagine trying to measure something when your ruler keeps changing length. It makes getting a precise reading really difficult. Jacob Holland-Lulovich over at Penn State mentions this specifically.
So it wasn't just measure the carbon, get the date.
Not for that period, no. Those fluctuations meant the results could be uncertain by, a century, sometimes even more.
A whole century. Wow. That's a huge margin of error if you're trying to build a timeline.
It really is. It makes pinning down specific events or changes incredibly hard.
Okay, so that was the problem. But the good news, the report says, is that scientists are finding ways around this.
Yes, definitely. Researchers like Sturt Manning at Cornell, they've been developing much more sophisticated ways to use radiocarbon dating.
What's different about their approach?
It involves using complex statistical models. They take multiple carbon dates from different items at a single site, say, different wooden posts from a structure, or bits of charcoal.
So more data points.
More data points, yes, but also smarter analysis. These models can process all those dates together to filter out the noise caused by the atmospheric fluctuations and really narrow down the possibilities.
Okay, that makes sense. Combining evidence.
And they have another trick up their sleeve. Tree rings.
From wooden artifacts, how do they help?
Well, trees grow a distinct ring each year, right? So if you have wood from a site, the pattern of rings gives you a really precise calendar. You can then compare the carbon dates from that wood directly against the tree ring sequence.
Like a cross-check.
Exactly. It's an independent check that's incredibly accurate. It helps calibrate and confirm the radiocarbon results.
That's really clever, and this is leading to much tighter date ranges.
Much tighter. The report mentions reducing that uncertainty down to maybe just a few decades instead of a century or more.
That's a game changer.
It really is. Eric Marsh, who works with similar methods, says this kind of resolution lets us tell a more human story. We can look at changes happening within a single generation, not just over vast stretches of time.
A generation that makes the past feel much closer, much more tangible. The report uses the Jean-Baptiste Linné site in Ontario as a key example of this shift, right?
Yes, it's a perfect case study. This was a huge Iroquois village, extensively excavated, and based on the fact that archaeologists found relatively few European artifacts.
They assumed it was early.
They assumed it was abandoned pretty early on, maybe around 1535. Soon after the first French explorers were in the area, the logic was, Not much European stuff. Must be from right around first contact.
But Sturt Manning saw the potential there, with all the wooden structures, for this new dating method.
Exactly. He suggested applying these advanced radiocarbon techniques. Jennifer Birch, who's now at UGA, took the lead on that redating work.
And the results were different.
Yeah, quite different. The new dates showed the site was actually occupied between about 1590 and 1615.
Wow. That's, what, 75 years later than they thought?
Roughly, yes. And nearly a full century after initial European contact in the region.
So the lack of European goods didn't mean it was early. It just meant, well, maybe they didn't have or want many European goods yet.
Precisely. Birch herself, the report says, was stunned. She apparently couldn't believe it for about 2 years.
I can imagine. And the wider reaction.
The quote in the report sums it up. We'd been off by 2 or 3 whole generations. It just threw the old timeline out the window for that site.
It really shows how much those earlier assumptions, based purely on artifact counts, could lead things astray. And this isn't just about one village in Ontario, is it?
No, not at all. The report makes it clear this is happening at other sites, too, up and down the East Coast. These refined dates are forcing a reevaluation everywhere.
Challenging the conventional wisdom, as the report puts it.
Absolutely. Challenging ideas about how quickly indigenous societies changed or didn't change after Europeans arrived, how long they persisted in certain areas or ways of life.
So it's more than just correcting dates on a chart. It's changing the actual story.
Fundamentally changing it in some cases.
The report also mentions pottery styles ceramic analysis as another traditional dating tool. How does the new carbon dating fit with that?
Oh, archaeologists have long tracked changes in pottery, how pots were made, decorated, and use those shifts to build relative timelines. Style A comes before Style B, and so on.
Okay.
These ceramic sequences are still useful, definitely, but the new carbon dates provide actual calendar years, a much more precise anchor. So now you can test those ceramic sequences against hard dates. Sometimes they match up, sometimes the carbon dates force a revision of the pottery timeline too.
Right, it adds a layer of precision. This leads to Victor Thompson's work in Georgia at the Muscogee Mounds, which sounds fascinating, done at the request of the Muscogee Creek Nation.
Yes, and that context is important. The Muscogee Nation has a deep connection to that land, despite their forced removal in the 19th century. They asked Thompson to reinvestigate the dating.
And his findings are challenging things, too.
His unpublished data, mentioned in the report, points to the Lamar site at Muscogee being the likely town of Ichizi. That's a town the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto visited way back in 1540.
But wasn't Ichizi thought to be somewhere else? A site with more European artifacts.
That was the previous assumption, yes. Again, based on finding more European stuff nearby. But Thompson's work at Lamar suggests otherwise.
So Ichizi might have been this major center visited by De Soto, even though it didn't have a lot of Spanish goods at that point.
It seems very possible. Which brings us back to that quote from Jacob Holland Lulevich.
And then one about agency. Just because European stuff exists, that doesn't mean indigenous people want it. They're not passive recipients.
Exactly that. It was an automatic adoption. Indigenous people made choices. And Thompson's dating shows Muscogee ancestors were living at Lamar well into the 1600s.
A century after De Soto passed through.
A full century later, they were there maintaining their town long after that initial contact.
That paints a very different picture of persistence.
It does. And Michelle Pickett's preliminary work in North Carolina suggests something similar for the Jora people. They famously destroyed a Spanish fort in 1568.
Right.
But her initial data suggests their villages continued to thrive long after that event, not disappear or immediately change drastically.
It counters that narrative of sudden collapse or transformation. RaeLynn Butler from the Muscogee Creek Nation has a powerful quote about this in the report.
She does. She says, people paint the picture that colonization was adopted abruptly, a one-night stay by a European, and we changed our life completely, and that's just not the case.
That really hits home. It wasn't instantaneous. It was complex, drawn out.
And these dates are providing the evidence for that more nuanced view. It highlights resilience and continuity alongside change.
The report also touches on indigenous people not just reacting, but actively shaping the economy, even before Europeans fully established trade networks. Tell us about the beaver pelts.
Yeah, this is Megan Ann Conger's work, also at UGA's lab. She looked at 2 sites in southern Ontario where there's evidence of large-scale beaver processing.
For the fur trade, presumably.
That was the assumption. The French formally set up the fur trade around 1580, so it was thought these sites dated to after that. driven by French demand.
But the carbon dates.
The carbon dates suggest this intensive beaver hunting and processing was happening decades before 1580.
Before the formal French demand was even there.
That's what the evidence indicates. It suggests indigenous communities were already engaged in this activity on a large scale, possibly for their own reasons or trade networks, before the French market really kicked in.
But they weren't just suppliers responding to European demand. They might have actually been driving that early production themselves.
It points towards significant indigenous economic agency, shaping the very beginnings of the fur trade. It flips the script a bit.
Definitely. Now, these new techniques sound amazing, but the report does mention some hurdles.
Yeah, they're not without challenges. One is cost. Getting these high-precision dates requires meticulous work.
Manning's quote about quality control is everything.
Exactly. That level of rigor costs money and time.
And Jennifer Birch brought up another point about integrating these findings, right?
Yes. She calls them microhistories. Each site gives you this incredibly detailed picture for its specific location and time.
Very focused.
Very focused. But the challenge then becomes how you connect all these individual microhistories together to build a bigger regional picture. It's different from the older, more generalized timelines based on artifacts found across wide areas.
So it's like having incredibly sharp puzzle pieces, but you still need to figure out how they all fit together.
That's a good analogy. You need to scaffold them together, as Birch puts it, to create that larger narrative.
And there's also a concern about accessibility, mentioned by RaeLynn Butler.
Right. She points out that the highly technical nature of this research, the statistics, the lab work, can sometimes create a distance between the archaeologists and the indigenous communities whose history is being uncovered.
Making it hard for the communities to connect with or utilize the findings.
Potentially, yes. She calls for much better communication, more collaboration, ensuring that this knowledge flows back to and is meaningful for the tribal nations.
It shouldn't just live in academic journals.
Absolutely not. And she raises a really fundamental question. Why is this contact period so crucial to understand? And how do these corrected timelines connect to the descendant communities today? It's about bridging that gap between past and present.
Making the history relevant and accessible.
Exactly.
Okay, so wrapping this up, the big aha moment from this deep dive seems to be that our picture of early North American history, especially around European contact, is undergoing a major revision.
Definitely. Thanks largely to these breakthroughs in radiocarbon dating. Old assumptions, particularly those based only on whether European goods were present or absent, are really being questioned.
And the new timelines often push dates later, showing more indigenous persistence and presence than previously thought.
In many key cases, yes. It reveals a more complex story of resilience, of agency, and suggests that cultural and economic shifts were often more gradual, less abrupt, than the old narratives implied.
They weren't just passively swept away.
Far from it. This research emphasizes their active role in navigating an era of immense change.
It really makes you think, if advancements in one field, like radiocarbon dating, can so dramatically reshape our view of the past, what other areas of history might be due for a similar reevaluation as science progresses? What other arbitrary divisions or long-held assumptions might need a closer look?
That's a great question to ponder. History is definitely not set in stone.